I'm Coach Mickey, and I'm so glad that you've joined us. And if this is your first time joining us, come on in and make yourself comfortable. For those of you that join us on a regular basis, I'm so glad that you do. And I look forward to hearing from each and every one of you. And thank you so much for reaching out to my guests. They love hearing from you, and thank you for supporting them. And today, as usual, as you guys know, I love to find guests that have got an interesting story, that are fun, full of adventure. And I have been looking forward to having on this guest today. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him like we always do, and we'll just jump right in. Captain Ross Roberts, he is the author of Unlearning to Fly, Navigating Turbulence and Bliss of Growing Up in the Sky. He flew the Atlantic alone in a single engine plane, sailed the Northwest Passage. He's the youngest licensed flight instructor in the United States, and he shared a VW bug with a moose and blew up his backyard. So, welcome.
Well,
Captain
nice.
Ross Roberts, how are you?
Very well, thank you. It's nice to be with you, Mickey. And I hope
So we're just going to jump right in. First of all, I want to talk about you becoming the youngest licensed flight instructor. And as my guests have heard, my circle of friends, as I call them, they know that I'm a pilot, helicopter. But I love having on pilots because we have such great experiences. So I really want to hear your story right from the beginning.
When I found out you were a pilot, I knew this was going to be an easy conversation because no matter where you go, if you're with a pilot, you instantly have something to talk about. So.
This is true. So let's just start. Well, you've been around planes since the beginning of your life. So let's just jump in right with that.
Yeah, I've always wanted to be an airline pilot since before I could remember. As a matter of fact, the first memory I have on Earth is doing a loop in an Aranca Champ when I was 3 years old with my father. So the first memory I have on this planet is being upside down in an airplane. And so airplanes have been just the thread that has woven my life together. And ever since I can remember, I wanted to be an airline pilot. So long story short, I wound up getting my private license on my 17th birthday. And between the time I was 17 and then 18, be able to get my commercial license, I discovered a loophole in the federal aviation regulations. They talked a lot about having the flight experience to be a commercial pilot, but they didn't talk about age when it came to getting a flight instructor certificate. So I took the written test and I made an appointment at the FAA and went down and, so you want to get your CFI today? Yeah, that's right. Okay, well. He looked at the paperwork and said, well, everything looks great, but wait a minute, how old are you? I said, I'm 17. Well, you have to be 18 to get a CFI. I said, well, that's what I thought too, but can we look at the regulations a little closer? Oh, no, you have to be 18. Okay, we'll take a look. And they found that there was no stipulation that you had to be 18 years old to get a CFI, a Certified Flight Instructor certificate. So we took the test, and he sent the paperwork off to the FAA headquarters in Oklahoma City and said, well, I know this is going to get kicked back. But they couldn't find a regulation either. So I wound up being a CFI at 17 years old.
I love it. That's great. Now, where were you? Where were you located when you first started to fly?
When I first actually started to fly, I was in Orange County, Virginia. My parents had taken over the operation of the Orange County Airport. Perfect for me. And so I began flying, taking lessons from my father, who was a CFI. I started taking lessons at 14 with him. So that's where I actually started flying.
So you've been around this your whole life, and it's just because that's just been your whole lifestyle to be able to.
My whole life, yeah. In my book, I start out at the very beginning, talking about my father was a mechanic for Capital Airlines, which was later absorbed into United Airlines. So he was a mechanic at Washington National Airport. We lived in Northern Virginia at the time. And he wanted to be an airline pilot too. He wanted to be an airline pilot almost as much as I did. So he was hanging around getting his licenses, and he was learning to fly at Beacon Field just outside Alexandria. And he was hanging around with all the airline pilots he could find. So they became fixtures at our house. And for me, that was like living on Mount Olympus, living with the gods at parties. And I remember Bob Smirno, for example, a Capital Airlines pilot, and Captain Al, Capital Captain, was at our house a lot of the parties. Some of those are described in the book. But yeah, I've been around airplanes and pilots my whole life. So these guys kind of set the tone for me early. Gave me
That's a crazy,
direction.
interesting group of guys to be hanging around. But as we know, though, when you get around other airline pilots, there's always a story. There's always information. You just have a lot. There's a camaraderie. There's a camaraderie about pilots. Like being up in the air is just an incredible adventure in itself. So having that opportunity as young as you did, and then becoming a flight instructor, had to have been such an incredible, not only accomplishment, but just a gift in everything that you've done, throughout your life, having that start.
It was a gift. And, you were talking on one of your episodes with Nick Spark, the episode about Pancho Barnes. And you were both talking about that, how around pilots, there's always a story. And he pointed out rightly that oftentimes, I think he was talking about Chuck Yeager and the air show pilot. My memory.
It's okay. I don't remember his name either. You're good.
Yeah, it'll come up about 10 minutes later when we're on to something else. Yeah, how sometimes when you're with the pilots, it's they can't. If you say, "Hey, tell me about," oh, I don't remember. It's these stories that sort of just rise up out of the ether that are so precious. And if you're not with them, if you're not in company with them, these stories will never be heard because they're not going to write them down. These are just things that happen, but the stories can be amazing. I remember we had a restaurant at our airport in Virginia, and we'd sit around the lunch counter, and I'd get the guys to tell me about their flights. We'd use salt and pepper shakers as the terrain, and our hands as airplanes, and I'd make these guys go through every detail of the flight that they were describing. What was the weather? What was the engine doing? How'd you feel? So we were dissecting the flights, and it's just such a rich place for especially a young person.
So what's one of your favorite stories? I mean, because you've got a lot of flight hours and you must have a couple. Like, what's the ones that stick out in your mind that just seem so dear to you?
Well, there are so many, and the one I start the book with is one that is sticks with me. I was ferrying that means delivering a single engine Cessna Cardinal to Europe. It was my first solo transatlantic trip. And I was wondering why I was out there in the first place. I launched out of, I always say we, it's me in the airplane. Launched out of Pennsylvania and flew up to Goose Bay, Labrador. And from there, I was going to fly nonstop to Iceland, get more fuel. We had ferry tanks on the airplane, which would be extra tanks. So I had about 24 hours of fuel on the airplane, which was an extraordinary fuel load. But I took off out of Goose Bay, and everything was fine for a while. The weather forecast was okay. But then the clouds that were supposed to be layered became one mass, and I found myself flying in the clouds below freezing. So naturally, the airplane's wings began to ice up. And so I thought, this is an ice fix. And I tried to climb to a different altitude to find clear air. And that didn't work. Got up to the airplane's maximum altitude. It would no longer climb. It was so heavy. I thought, well, the only thing we can do is go down, maybe find some warmer air down below. So about that time, as I was descending, I got into the worst turbulence I've had experienced before or since. The airplane was, I describe it as being in a terrier's mouth. It was just being thrown around violently. My head, even though I was in the shoulder harness and seatbelt, and my head was banging against the ceiling and my shoulders up against the door. And it was really tough. And I was wondering, put faith in the engineers and mechanics who built the airplane, that they had done the work. And sure enough, nothing broke. And airplane survived, and so did I. And it was funny because as we got below the cloud layer, I realized the turbulence was gone and the airplane was fine and I was fine. But what had happened during that turbulence is that we had they call it a wet compass. It's just a normal compass that is on top of the instrument panel. And it floats in a bath of liquid to keep it damp, its motions dampened. So as we were in the turbulence, the compass card, the thing that tells you what direction you're going, jumped up off of its peg and wedged itself in the corner, no longer to move, which proved to be a bit of a problem because earlier I had lost my directional gyro, effectively lost it. It was not functioning properly either. So here I was in the middle of the Labrador Sea, at least 300 or 400 miles away from land, with no way to tell what direction I was going. So that was an interesting situation. Below the clouds like that too, I couldn't see the sun. I couldn't get a bearing on the sun. No land to look at. So that was an interesting fix. But obviously, things worked out. I'm talking to you.
Yeah, it's amazing because there's other things that you learn as a pilot, and even for myself as a skydiver. I've had situations where everything else is, you don't have it available anymore, and you have to go to the most, well, I don't want to say primitive, but think about it. People have used the sun, the wind, and other elements to be able to get your direction. And for you to come out of something like that, I think the scariest thing is the frozen wings, because that you have no idea. And especially then put turbulence on top of it. Yeah, that's pretty exciting. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I mean, you just use what you have, don't you? You just you don't have this anymore. What do we have? What do we have left? Let's use this. This should work. And it worked out fine. I was able to get a bearing off of a radio station somewhere. I don't know where it was initially. And okay, well, the direction finding needle on the radio is pointing. I'll just maintain that bearing. And that it worked out. Eventually I got to Greenland. And of course, it's more, I detail it quite a bit in the book, but got to Greenland, was able to fix the compass and went on my way.
That's a heck of a solo. I mean, it really is for a solo trip. My gosh. I mean, good for you.
Yeah, the weird thing is, I was 25 years old and I was immortal, at that age. And I wound up doing 9 more of those solo transatlantic trips after that.
That's awesome. Speaking of navigating, I want to talk about you sailing the Northwest Passage. I had an opportunity to listen to some of your video that you sent me through that YouTube when you were speaking at that museum. And I caught part of the story, but I'd like to touch on that a little bit because you've lived such a life of adventure and going from the air to sea. I think a lot of those cross over when it comes to navigating. But yeah, I would like to hear that story.
Yeah, Alan Alda on his great podcast about communication and science always asks a question of his listeners at the end: what is the book that most influenced you in your life? And for me, I thought about that. It was Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki, Across the Pacific by Raft. I've always been interested in sailing and, of course, airplanes since the very beginning. But once I saw Gregory Peck in Moby Dick and then watched the documentary of Kon-Tiki, the ocean and sailing in particular just held me tight. And I remember being in the 3rd grade and I was having trouble reading. I couldn't read. I think there were 7 different teachers in 1st grade, which didn't help us. It didn't help the continuity in the reading department. But for whatever reason, by the time I got to 3rd grade, I was just not reading. I was faking it. And I thought I was faking it. We went to the library one day, and it was about a week or 2 after I'd seen the documentary Kon-Tiki, and I found the book in the library. And Mrs. Brimsmaid was my teacher, and she said, "Russell, don't you want to check out a book with more pictures in it?" I said, "No, I really want this book." She said, "Well, that's a mighty big, thick book." I nodded. And the librarian was looking over her half glasses at me and knowing that Russell couldn't read that book either. I said, no, this is the book I want to take home this weekend. And, it has pictures in it. There were photographs in the middle. It has some pictures. And they kind of shook their head. And, well, Russell went home with that book. And I literally slept with it for the next. It just meant so much to me to have this book, this Heyerdahl telling this story. He had written these words down. It was nice to see the documentary, but to have this book, and I have to say that's the book that had the most effect on me. So anyway, the sailing thing started there. And the Northwest Passage, well, of course, I'd read all the stories about Amundsen and John Franklin, and all the early explorers in the West for the Northwest Passage. Well, I was off work. I was on leave for some time and was cruising around. I was sort of shopping for a sailboat myself and ran across Captain Eric Forsyth's website. And he was seeking to try the Northwest Passage for himself, and he needed a crew. So I emailed him. I said, I can hand reef and steer, I'd like to come with you at least for, a part of your trip. I can give you a couple of months. And he said, well, come on up and meet me. The English fellow, he was a electrical engineer that worked at the Brookhaven National Laboratory up in New York. But he said, yeah, come on up and maybe we're having a party, a going away party, and you can see the boat and let me know what you think. So I did. I drove up. He showed me the boat, met some of his friends. After about 5 minutes of this, he said, well, are you coming with us? I said, well, yeah, sure. I can give you, like I said, a couple of months. So, it was about 3 weeks later, I met up with him in Greenland to tackle the Northwest Passage over the ice-choked waters of the Canadian Arctic.
What was that like? That had to have been an experience.
It was cold. I joined the boat in July 2009 in Greenland, and Eric and I became experts on how to read ice charts and predict where icebergs might be. But it was cold. It was about maximum 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 Celsius. And we spent most of our time out on deck looking for ice. And I was on board for 7 weeks and wearing practically all the clothes I brought. And my pervading memory of that trip was the cold and how tired we got. But it was an adventure. I mean, you look at a globe and you think, man, that's way up there. I mean, you're practically, at one point we were only 900 miles from the North Pole in a 42-foot fiberglass pleasure craft. So yeah, it was an interesting experience. The cold. Eric did have a furnace on board, but it had the heat of like a Christmas tree bulb. There wasn't a whole lot of BTUs coming out of that baby.
Did you get an opportunity to stop and meet any of the Inuit people while you were traveling?
Yes. One of the things that we were experiencing in the summer of 2009 in Baffin Bay, we started in Nuuk in Greenland. It used to be called Godhab, but the Inuit word for the town is Nuuk, N-U-U-K. That's where I joined the boat. And incidentally, that's also where I had landed in that Cessna Cardinal to fix the compass. So it was like the kind of a full circle coming around. So this time I was going to be leaving Nuuk in a fiberglass sailboat. Anyway, we took off and we were noticing there just wasn't a whole lot of wind. Only about 90% of the time we were having to motor, burning diesel fuel. So we were going to go nonstop to Resolute in the middle of the Canadian archipelago, but we realized we weren't going to have the fuel to do that. So the nice thing about that, we were able to visit 2 of the Greenland towns way up north. We stopped at Sisimiut and got fuel, and then we essentially motored on up to Pernavik, which was our last fuel stop in Greenland, and then shot straight across the northern part of Baffin Bay into the heart of the Northwest Passage in Lancaster Sound. So yeah, dodging ice and learning how to predict where it might be. But it was an exercise in fuel management for sure.
Well, from the stories you're telling me, seems like you always have this experience with ice. Have you ever gone or sailed any place warmer? I
You
guess.
know, I think that might be the first time that I've realized that. Yeah, over the Arctic like that, and the little airplanes on the sailboat. Yeah, it was a story of ice, wasn't it? Yeah,
That's
yeah.
so funny.
Yeah. Well, for some reason, I found myself in the northern latitudes a lot. I had talked to you just a few minutes ago about Orange County Airport in Virginia, and then my dad working for Capital Airlines in Northern Virginia. Well, between Northern Virginia and back in Orange County, my folks decided to move to Alaska. So in 1960, they hauled my sister and I and our mother, my parents hauled the two kids up the Alaska Highway in a Volkswagen Bug to resettle in Alaska. My dad thought that the wilds of northern United States might hold more promise for a flying job, so that's where he went on a open prayer, and we wound up spending 7 years there. So maybe that's where maybe there's something that got embedded in me, and I kind of was craving the northern latitudes after that. Who knows?
I love Alaska. Alaska is beautiful. And I have to give credit to Alaskan bush pilots because I've seen some of those guys and gals land in some pretty crazy area, especially some of the glacier pilots or well, the bush pilots. I've had an opportunity. I go up to Alaska quite often,
Oh,
and I
good.
love it up there. There's just something about it. It's you either love Alaska or you don't understand it, and Alaska just kind of gets in your soul. There's just a part of Alaska that's just amazing. The people, the culture, the just the wildlife, like you said, which leads me to this next question because I gotta hear the story of how you shared a VW bug with a moose. And I'm sure that was in the Alaska aspect of your life.
It was. My father went there to build flying time in hopes of then getting an airline job somewhere back in the lower 48. So while in Alaska, he became a bush pilot, flying Cessna 180s, airplanes like that, some Super Cubs out in the bush. He never flew on floats. There's so many bush pilots who are float plane pilots. My dad was always a land-based pilot. But well, the moose story. We traveled to Alaska in I think it was 1959 Volkswagen Bug. Everything we owned was on top of the Bug. Oh, we got to Alaska, and initially there was no job, no good job for him in Anchorage, so we resettled almost right away in Fairbanks. So one weekend there was no flying going on, and my dad decided it would be a great time to take the kids up to the Arctic Circle, to go up to Circle Hot Springs and see what that was all about. Neither of my parents realized at the time that Circle Hot Springs was actually 65 miles south of the Arctic Circle, so the kids weren't going to get to the actual line anyway. But never mind, off we went. I think it was about 100 miles from Fairbanks to Circle Hot Springs on a gravel highway. So apparently, from my point of view, the only thing they packed for the day trip was a cooler of sodas and beer and maybe a few sandwiches. And so we took off about three-quarters of the way up there. I was flying my hand out the open window of the car. Have you ever done that, Mickey, where when you were a kid, you stuck your hand out the window of the car and you flew it?
Yes,
Did you
I still
did
do
you
it
ever
as an
do that?
adult.
You can, as a kid, I discovered what flaps were for. I'd bend my hand a certain way and I could make my hand fly. And anyway, that's what I was doing. Fly my hand out the window, not paying much attention on the car. I noticed my airspeed was reducing on my hand, and I couldn't develop. The car was slowing down. My dad had shut the engine off and put it neutral and just kind of glided to a stop. And then he reached around and from underneath my feet took his 300 H&H Magnum rifle out and slowly opened the door. And then I looked out the front window, and there was this big bull moose standing right in the middle of the highway. Everybody was dead quiet in the car. So he took a bead on it from behind the door, kerbam. The moose looked kind of surprised, crumpled right in the middle of the highway. So now here we were. So I think it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, fall. So sundown was coming soon, fairly soon. He had 1,000 pounds of moose in the middle of the road. Like I said, there was no preparation for this day trip that I could see, but he had his rifle. Next thing I know, he opened up the front of the bug, that's where the storage, that's where the trunk is on those things. He took out a knife, he took out an axe, he took out a saw, and he commenced to butcher the moose in the middle of the highway. That went on for hours. And he also had visqueen, that's plastic sheeting, so he's able to wrap the meat up as he butchered it. He'd wrap the meat up in visqueen and stack it up. Well, it became nighttime. And it got really dark. So he positioned my mother in between the front lights of the bug. Said, "Okay, honey, if here's the shotgun. If you hear a bear coming up on me, shoot it." She hadn't touched a gun in years, and I was kind of worried that she would get excited and maybe shoot my dad. And it was an interesting situation. Well, sure enough, a little while later, there was a rustling in the bushes, and everybody thought there was a grizzly coming, and all of a sudden a great horned owl flew over top of us and wanted a little bit of the moose. So fortunately, my mother didn't have to apply her marksmanship that evening. Well, eventually we got everything packed up. My dad had everything packed pretty well, except for the hindquarters, the rear legs of the moose. There was no more room. He had been packing the bug, every part of the bug, the passenger compartment, the trunk, the rack on the roof had moose wrapped up in it. And so no hindquarters, couldn't fit them anywhere. Well, fortuitously, the only vehicle of the entire day came rumbling by with a guy with a flatbed truck. He stopped. He says, "Well, you folks need any help?" Well, my dad says, "I don't want to leave these hindquarters behind you. Could you throw them on the back?" "Oh, sure. I'll throw them on the back of the truck. Here's my address. Come by in the morning and pick them up in Fairbanks." So, it seems there's always help when you need it. Well, meanwhile, so we're ready to go, and Dad said, "Well, let's drive on back." I said, "What about the rack? What about the antlers? Not going to leave those behind, are you?" I started crying because no hunter can leave the moose antlers behind. And he said, "Oh, we just don't have room for them, son." My mom looked at him, and next thing I know, the axe and the saw is coming back out of the bug, and he's whacking away at the antlers and got him and stuck him somewhere, tied him onto the bug. And so from then on, I had moose antlers over the door of the house. I could remember that day. It was wonderful. But in the bug, we were, my sister and I, sitting on wrapped up packages of bloody moose, and you can imagine the smell. It was horrendous. That way, our little head, we weren't that tall, but our heads were banging against the ceiling because there was that much moose we were using for seats. And my dad was, from time to time, was rather unusual. So that's the story of the moose, Mickey.
That's interesting. Well, and again, for my circle of friends that listen, if you have not been to Alaska, or if you're not hunters, you have to understand that in that area, everything is used. Everything. I mean, because it gets so difficult in a lot of areas of Alaska. And I was asking you about the Inuit, because I had an opportunity to go up to Barrow, Alaska. And when I was up in Barrow, they, as a culture and as a community, they use everything. I mean, because they're at the top of the world. They're right at the end of the is it the Baltic Sea? It's up there. Is it that one?
The Beaufort Sea.
Yeah. And so they I mean, between the furs and the meat, and they use everything for fuel. So I like the fact that at least your dad he knew what to do. And then I'm sure you probably were eating moose for the rest of the year, because that's a lot of meat.
Moose and caribou, we acquired a caribou also. And yeah, absolutely. They use everything. That's one thing when on the Northwest Passage on the as Eric called it, the yacht Fiona. When we got to Resolute, it, as I described it in the talk that you saw, um, it looked like Resolute was built on in a gravel pit with a dump. I mean, the whole town looked like that. Just everything, you never can tell when you might have to use this old bit of snow machine or washing machine. Everything is saved. You never know when you might find a nut or a bolt or a fan belt, so they keep everything, and it looks terrible. And the whole town smelled like, I finally realized it smelled like a uh, open graveyard for mice, that dead mouse smell. Well, the whole town smelled like that because they had seals that were being used for dog food. They had bear hides. They even had some whale parts there and just left out to kind of rot. And, so it acquired this interesting aroma. My mother pointed out years before in Fairbanks. So she said, yeah, the place looks awful. But then when it snows, in the wintertime, it's dark and it's also everything's covered in 3 feet of snow. So in wintertime, it all becomes quite beautiful. Have you been there in winter?
Yeah, I've never been in the winter. I've been to Fairbanks. I've been up to Fairbanks. I usually go during the shoulder months. So
Yes,
I'll go like in May or sometimes August, when they're
right,
still getting snow. But yeah, it's like I said, it's a different lifestyle because it's not like here. It's not like in the United States down here in the lower 48 where you're like, okay, I can just run over here and get this. There's miles, sometimes hundreds of miles, especially between Anchorage and Fairbanks. You take was it the Parks Highway? There's
yeah,
nothing there. You might get maybe Talkeetna is there, and you got a couple little towns, but you're not going to Home Depot. You're not going to the grocery store. It's a different lifestyle. So I
right.
can understand why if you've got something, you're going to hang on to it and utilize it. But isn't that what we do as pilots, though? I mean, we've always got things that we might need because you just never know. You always
Right.
have some kind of bag, that you're taking with you because you just never know what kind of situation you're going to be in. Like you said,
That's exactly right. When the old airline pilot, Bob Smyrno, I mentioned earlier, came up to visit us from Virginia, he rolled into Fairbanks one day, went out to the airport and rented a Cessna 172 to take just a short ride around so he could get the lay of the land. He had only been airborne 10 minutes. He landed and said, I got to get some equipment. So, he went to the hardware store and they had everything he needed, a tent, an axe, made sure he had a gun with. He realized right off the bat, if he went down in the 1960s Alaska, there was a chance he'd just be lost. And there were every year up there at that time, there were pilots who had gone never to be seen again. I don't know if you ever heard of Ben Eielson, Carl Ben Eielson.
mm-mm.
He was an early pioneer. I think he was the first real bush pilot in Alaska. Uh, Pioneered airmail service up there. Fascinating story. He came up from Minnesota. He was a school teacher, landed his airplane in the ballpark there in Fairbanks and started an air service. And there's so many stories. There's a wonderful book you might enjoy. Gene Potter wrote it. It's called The Flying North, and it's all the stories of the early bush pilots, Ben Eielson, Noel Ween, people like that, Archie Trammell, guys that really pioneered. And that was the 1930s. By the 1960s, when my father was flying there, things had progressed quite a bit. But remember, even 1960, there were only 2 VOR stations in the whole state, one in Fairbanks and one in Anchorage. That's for then the modern VHF Omni range navigation station. There were only 2 in the whole state.
Oh my
There was no
gosh.
such thing as GPS. No, there was no such thing as Loran or Loran C. I mean, it was basically just dead reckoning and pilotage. And weather forecasts were loud. It was still the Wild West even as late as 1960. Did you do any flying yourself up there?
I had an opportunity to fly a float plane.
Oh,
So we were out. I've got land up there, and the only way my land is very remote, and the only way to see my land is you have to actually hire a bush pilot, and you go out there, and we put in the coordinates and flew over, and just happened to be we were flying in, and he said, "Hey, you want to make a pit stop?" We stopped at one of his friend's house, totally off the grid, landed on her lake, and stopped there, had lunch. She had this amazing garden. And then he said, "You want to fly?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So
what kind of airplane? What?
had an opportunity to fly back to Anchorage. And actually, no, I was on the Kenai Peninsula. I was on the Kenai Peninsula because my land's in Nikiski, which is a little bit down from it's so let's see. I'm trying to think of Kenai's a little bit south of Anchorage, but it's off the Cook Inlet.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Prince William Sound is to the east, I think. Yeah. Beautiful. That's one of the most beautiful parts of the whole state. Gorgeous. What kind of airplane was it?
You know what? I don't remember. I don't remember. It was so many years ago. I
Oh,
don't. I remember just because, like I said, my thing's helicopters, and because I started with fixed wing, but then I went on to helicopters. A lot of, but like anything that gets me in the air, I'll do it. I'll fly it.
well, tell me
I
about
mean,
that.
I didn't land it or anything. He just let me fly while we were up.
Unless you were a Vietnam pilot, getting into helicopters is kind of unusual. Well, tell me about that.
Oh my
How did that-
gosh. I had I live here in Southern California, and from across where I live is Catalina Island. And there's two ways to get to Catalina. One is to either go by boat, which is about an hour and a half, or two, you can get a helicopter and take it out of Long Beach. And I just said, I'm going to do the helicopter. That'd be really fun. It's quicker, it's faster, and it'd be kind of fun. Hopped in. And so because I'm so light, and if you know anything about planes and helicopters, you have to distribute the weight correctly. Because so I'm light, I was up front. And they had everybody
Mhm.
else in the back. And there was three other people in the back. And I remember looking and I was watching, and I was so excited to watch, how he was working, the cyclic and the collective. And I was watching the
Yep.
pedals, and I was like so excited that by the time I got to Catalina, all I wanted to do was go back and take lessons on how to fly a helicopter. And so I did my thing at Catalina, came back. We actually took the boat back, came back that way. I went right down to Oceanside. I actually was in Carlsbad, and there's a place called Palomar Airport, and met a helicopter pilot that was there. He's from Germany. He was a flight instructor. He was just trying to launch his business. And I said, "Hey, I'll make a deal with you." My background is marketing and advertising. And he was trying to think. I said, I didn't have the money then to learn how to fly because it was expensive to take lessons.
Very.
And I said, "I'll make a deal with you. If you will teach me how to fly, I'll market your business." And that's what we did. And we traded
Wow.
off. We kind of bartered. And he did. He taught me how to fly. I learned to do a Robbie.
Wow.
So, and
What
that's how
kind
I
of
learned how to fly.
helicopter did you start out in?
Robbie. It was just
Yeah, R-22, the
22. Yeah, I was in a
yeah.
22, Robbie 22. I loved it. And to be honest with you, I'm going to tell you, Russ, for me, I I have problems with my ears, and so for me, I want to always be stable because I don't like anything that's twisty turny. So I give you
Yeah.
credit for somebody who can actually do the loops and all that. And the
Mhm.
first thing I learned how to do was hover. And he's like, "I've never seen anybody get hovering down," and because he'd take me out to this field, and I was learning how to hover, and he was little on the crazy side, but that's what I loved about him because it made me a much better pilot. He's like, "Okay, I want you're in this empty parking lot." He goes, "Stay on the lines on the parking lot, going, and you are just above the ground, and you're learning how to hover and land on uneven areas." And I just,
Yeah.
as you can tell, I love it. I love flying. It was
Yeah.
such an incredible experience. And unfortunately, he moved on to other things, and I had moved away. But like I said, there's something about being in the air that you just have to. It's just in your soul. You just
Yes.
becomes part of, like you said, the plane. You said we, yes, because you become part of that equipment, and it's not. I just becomes part of you. Whether you're flying an airplane, whether you're flying a helicopter, it's just you and that. That other
That's
entity of you in the
exactly
sky.
right. Whether that's an R-22, whether that's a Cessna Cardinal, whether that's an Airbus A330, same thing. You become you become one. And I think that's where that whole we thing comes with, if it's just you in the aircraft, it's still we, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Hey, we got a little bit of time, but because I mentioned it in the intro, I've got to hear the story of how you blew up your backyard.
Oh, that's another of my father's stories.
Oh,
You
okay.
know,
Well, I want to hear about you because what are you doing now? What are you doing at this time? And I know you're traveling and you're doing a lot of speaking engagements, but if people want to connect with you, and of course, as everybody knows, all your information will be embedded into the podcast. You guys will have an opportunity to reach out and get find his book online and on Amazon. And then also, what's going on with you? What are you doing?
yeah, yeah, everything's on the website there. There's a link. Folks can send messages, what have you. So, yeah, what's happening? I retired from the airline 4 years ago, and so I'm a retired airline captain now, and hanging out mainly in the Pacific Northwest. I'm here in my house in Central Highlands of Mexico right now, so doing that. I still have airplanes. I have a little amphibian, a Sea Ray. Incidentally, you remember Richard Bach, the author, wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull. You recall that?
Yes, that was one of my favorite books. I love that book.
Well, Richard owned this airplane that I have now, and he wrote a book about the very machine. It's called Travels with Puff. He named the airplane Puff, and in the book, of course, being Richard, the airplane spoke to him and this kind of thing. I have to say that since I've had the airplane for almost 3 years now, it's never spoken to me, but there you go. You never can tell. Anyway, I have that airplane, and also in the book, I describe in Alaska, my father bought a Luscombe aircraft, a little two-seater, which he subsequently he wrecked it. And the last I saw, I thought it was my airplane, being 5, 6 years old. The last I saw of my airplane, it left on the back of a flatbed truck in the cloud of dust down Griddell Avenue in Fairbanks. Well, as I was writing the book, I was curious whatever happened to the airplane. I was able to find it. It was still on the FAA registry, and I contacted the owner. I said, "Oh, what's the story with the airplane?" Long story short, he said, "It's in a hangar. It came with the property I bought. If you want it, you can have it." So it didn't take me more than a week. I went up and picked up the remains of the airplane, and now that's being restored in Missouri, and we should have it. Well, I should have it finished there in the next 6 months or so. So, two little airplanes that are occupying my time, and traveling around, like you said, doing the Mexico thing now, which is kind of fun. And that's what I'm doing now, writing the next book, writing the sequel to the first one.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Well, I have had so much fun with you being here with me, and I love your stories. I love people that have take their passion and do so much with it in their life, and you definitely know how to live a life of adventure. And I one of the things I was drawn to you was the fact that some people say, "Oh, I wish I did," or "I would like to," but you just took what you had and what you wanted and your passion. You said, "This is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it." And you can look back on your life and still keep going forward with your life, doing so many wonderful, adventurous things. And that's what it's all about, right? Is
Well,
finding as
yeah, I
much
like to
adventure.
say, I'm not an adventurer. I don't seek out adventure. I like to, I kind of see myself as a collector of stories, a collector of experiences, So
It's your
over,
adventure, though.
yeah,
It's your life, it's your adventure, and not the stories that you have to tell and for what you've done. I mean, from flying to sailing, I mean that does take a lot of I mean, for lack of better words, it takes a lot of I don't say courage because but you just have to want to do it. You just have to have that.
curiosity,
Yeah.
curiosity.
Yeah.
That's for me. That's it. It's just what lies over the next, next hill, what lies over that horizon. That's it. Curious. I'm curious. Want to know what's next.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And again, I will put in all the links into not only to the podcast, but also here on the YouTube. So you'll see them down below. And then if this is your first time coming in, please, if you'd like to hear more of my guests, or if you have a suggestion for a guest, please let me know. You have all the ways to contact me. You can go to Coach Mickey and Friends, and that'll give you also some of our older podcast guests. But is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
Well, I just wanted to say it was a real pleasure being here with you. I wish we had more time to tell more airplane stories. Pilots,
Well, I'm
you know
going to
how
have
that
you
is.
back.
That can go on forever, right? But yeah, I really enjoyed my time with you, Mickey. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you. I definitely want to have you back when you have your next book. All right, you guys, thank you so much for being with us. And I will look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, that's on this side. Most courageous thing you can do is be yourself. Until then, I will see you. Bye.
This episode was brought to you by keeponsharing.com. They're calling themselves the first truly ethical social network. They'll share back 50% of their revenue with their users, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's free to register, and they never sell your information. You can list your products, events, and content for free. Adult content accounts, be gone. They're fun, positive, and encouraging sites supporting local business. In a day and age where social media sites, even well-established ones, are being brought to light left and right for their questionable and sometimes downright archaic business practices, keeponsharing.com is a well-needed breath of fresh air. While you can share personal content, news articles, or just about anything for fun and profit, the marketplace allows practically anyone to sell anything at any time from anywhere. But on this site, you are the boss. I cannot express how amazing it is that keeponsharing.com shares 50% of all revenue back with the users, on top of having a truly transparent, supportive, and clean business model. Check them out. I'm signing up. Will you? Go ahead and meet me on there. Just go to keeponsharing.com. A link will be provided in this episode's description.